this was mentioned in the last video, but I will cover it here too just in case. The camera I was using up until this point crapped out on me, so I had to switch over to using my phone as the primary camera for these videos because it does record in a similar resolution, just at kind of half the frame rate. So things are going to be a little fuzzy and out of focus at first, but I eventually do figure out how to set it up a little bit better. We're going to have to see how badly it affects the quality of my videos going forward, but for the most part, should be alright to at least keep doing this until I do find an alternative to the camera I was using before. Now, recording issues aside, this mold, there were mistakes made. I had certain assumptions in my head based on sort of the way the silicone seemed, and that may sound a little bit weird for a few reasons, but what I had used before was the Alumilite High Strength 3 mold making silicone, which came in a near identical, like the package was the same size, it had the same size container. I want to say the bottle for the catalyst was a little bit differently, but it came with the same scoops, the same little cups. Like it even kind of smelled the same, as weird as that is to say. But this, even the coloring was the same. But this is not the same kind of silicone, and that's just sort of the weird world of mold making silicones, is that they can look very similar but be very different in a few very important ways. This silicone, I think it's literally just called Amazing Molding Rubber, or Amazing Art Rubber or something. You can get it at Michael's Crafts, and the main reason I got it was because I had a coupon, and they were close by. Not the best criteria for buying materials, but I might do something on that topic a little bit later on. So long and short, I'd assumed this material would have the same level of give and stretch that the Alumilite stuff had. It turns out it doesn't. It's still very durable. It's got quite a bit of stretch to it, as you can see me manhandling it here, but it does not have the same kind of qualities. It's almost dense is the word I would use for it. It's like it doesn't have a lot of squish, I guess that'd be the word to use. But my assumption was this would be like the previous silicone I had just used. It would have a little bit of give, and then the unusual shape, the arrangement of the gondola's legs would just kind of squeeze in on the mold, because the resin rather would be more dense, and that would just kind of push up against the silicone and you would just pop free. Turns out it didn't quite work that way, and there's a lot more struggle involved with freeing a single casting from this mold. And my initial appraisal of this mold was that I should just get the gondola out of there in one piece, which is why I'm trying my hardest not to scratch him up or break him or snap his legs or anything like that while pulling him out, and then just go straight into making another mold. Just try again. After toying with it for a bit, I decided that the mold was passable, because it did actually give me some pretty decent results, but yeah, there's definitely problems with this mold. So it helps to know your materials, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. There's not always a good way to find out what the qualities of material are until you've used them. In some cases you can find like the tensile strength, the hardness, the durometer rating, or whatever that is from, like, Smooth On is very, very good about making sure that all of their materials have very, very detailed information available to them. But this stuff is just kind of generic silicone that you can get off the shelf, which means that there's not a lot of information you can find or a lot of testimonials you can look up for how this stuff performs specifically in reference to other materials, other silicones you may have used. But in the future, I will plan accordingly and work with it rather than having the unpleasant surprise of realizing that I've cut the wrong sort of material. In the video there, you can see me just kind of comparing it to the Alumilite silicone that I had before deciding, unfortunately, that I had to cut into this mold twice. If I was using the Smooth-On Umu 30 silicone, that would be a big no-no. After a couple castings, that thing would just rip into 3 pieces and it would be useless. Fortunately, this stuff is surprisingly hardy, and doing that 3-way cut has not caused it to rip or tear or split apart any more than I wanted it to. However, that same durability is what makes it such a tricky mold to use. But I think for now we're going to skip ahead to the part where it's already out and I do a little casting on it, just so you can see how the first result came out. One moment here. After slapping some rubber bands on it, I grabbed what I affectionately call the cheapo resin. This can also be bought at Michael's, and I often buy it with a coupon. I think it's literally just called Amazing Casting Resin. Also have my little hand sander off to the side. I find that tapping the mold with that, giving the mold a good shake, causes all of the resin to kind of seep into the very fine cracks and details and all the little problem areas, which can be good because it allows the resin to get into any air bubbles inside the mold that you might not be able to get to. And then you can chip those off. So instead of having a negative dent inward, you have a positive air bubble outward that can just be chipped and sanded off. It's very preferable. Of course, keeping bottles clean. I guess that would be the part A. I think it's the catalyst part of the 2-part resin. Has a habit of turning kind of dry and crusty and causing the lid on the bottle to become kind of gooed into place. So yeah, make sure to sort of wipe your stuff down. And then from there, it's the usual process. 1-to-1 ratio, mixed up very nicely. Make sure there's no stringy strands in there or anything, and then pour away. In this case, I mixed up, I believe, about 2 fluid ounces of resin, which turned out to be way too much, which is where another little handy tip comes up, which is to have other molds nearby. If you've got old molds or other projects, I have molds for some little RPG miniatures sitting around. Here you can see me vibrating it with the hand sander. But as I was saying, instead of just letting your excess resin cure in the bottom of the cup and go completely to waste, having a smaller mold or something to dump it into can be pretty handy. And then really quick here, just something I wanted to show. The rubber bands I was using, I'm not sure what they're made out of, but for whatever reason, when a curing resin touches them, not always, but most of the time, it causes the rubber band to just snap and fly off. At this stage, that's not too much of a problem, but it is something to watch out for, especially if you do have a mold bound very tightly, and rubber bands start snapping away. I find that the little beige rubber bands, your standard office rubber bands, don't give you as much of that problem though. So now we're on to the removal process, and right away you'll notice I kind of start doing it and pulling it away and then immediately stop and push it back together. That was because the resin at that point was still very, very soft, to the point that the entire piece was kind of flexing underneath the pressure of my fingers. And you really don't want that on the off chance that you wiggle him out of there and his legs are completely bent out of place or deformed. I mentioned this in the previous video. You want to give it a chance to cool down. And one of the things you can actually see here is that the air channel completely cast, which there is something I want to go over with those, but I think I'm going to save that for a special video. So, after lots of trouble, both getting the original piece out of there and getting the mold into a usable shape, the first casting was surprisingly good, even with the cheapo resin. One of the things I neglected to do, which, yet again, I made a lot of mistakes, but one of the things I neglected to do was clean out all of the little bits of paint and other miscellanea that kind of gets stuck in there. Even with the mold release, the silicone still has a habit of kind of pulling little bits of stuff off of your piece, so what can end up happening is you'll get little flakes of paint in there, which is kind of exactly what happened. And you can see right here, there's a little piece right in his lip area, I suppose you would call it. And then there's another piece right in his right shin. And here I'm actually using a lot of the same techniques I used on the Sculpey piece to clean up all the little seam lines and any little marks. But as I said before, the thing that made me decide not to just scrap this mold outright was that this thing actually turned out really, really nicely. Every little detail in the face is perfect. There's no air bubbles in there. The seams on the legs and back are very manageable. The sprue on the back of the head cleans off without much problem at all. So yeah, despite the difficulties it gives me, like, it's hard to argue with the results. And I actually did go on to cast about a dozen more copies off of this one mold using both kinds of resins. And aside from one screw up, which I will cover in a special 5th video, I was very, very happy with how this came out. So that means sooner or later I might have some gondolas for sale, or gondolas to give out to friends. So with one last visit from one of the cats, and all of the usual spiel, like, comment, social media things, ask me questions if you have them. For now though, I have one last thing to show you, and I'll let it speak for itself. Thanks for watching.